The lock had been changed while I was still in the hospital bed. I didn't find out right away. My son-in-law, Marcus, was the one who drove me home from the ER after the fall. He helped me to the front door, put the key in, and it didn't turn. He looked at it for a second, then said he'd forgotten. They'd had a locksmith come by after a break-in attempt on the street 2 weeks ago. He said my daughter Renee had just forgotten to get me a copy made. He said it like it was nothing. I stood on the porch of the house I'd owned for 31 years and waited while Marcus went inside to get me a spare key. I looked at the maple tree in the front yard that I'd planted the spring Renee was born. It was October. The leaves were orange and red, and a few of them drifted down across the driveway while I stood there holding my ribs. That was the moment I should have known. That was the moment, if I'm being honest with myself, when everything I'd been telling myself for the past 8 months stopped being believable. But I didn't act on it. Not yet. My name is Frank. I'm 68 years old. I spent 32 years working as a claims investigator for a regional insurance company in western Pennsylvania. Not glamorous work, but I was good at it. I knew how to read people. I knew when a story had holes in it. I knew when someone was leaving something out. It's a strange thing to be good at noticing dishonesty in strangers and completely blind to it in your own family. My wife, Carol, passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 7 months from the diagnosis, fast enough that neither of us ever quite adjusted to the idea. We'd been married 40 years. The house was paid off. I had my pension, my Social Security, a modest retirement account. Nothing extravagant, but solid. Carol and I had always been careful with money. After she died, the house felt enormous. Renee is our only child. She and Marcus had been married 9 years. They lived about 40 minutes away in a 2-bedroom apartment they'd been renting since they moved in together, and they had a daughter, my granddaughter Lily, who was 6. Renee worked part-time as a dental hygienist. Marcus was in HVAC contracting, supposedly running his own small business, though it seemed to be in a constant state of about to take off. It was Marcus who suggested they move in. He didn't call it that at first. He called it being there for you, Frank. This was about a year after Carol died, maybe 14 months. I was doing all right, genuinely. I had routines. I had a neighbor I played cards with on Thursdays. I was volunteering 2 mornings a week at the food bank downtown. I wasn't thriving exactly, but I wasn't drowning either. Marcus took me to lunch one Sunday, just the 2 of us, which was unusual, and he laid it out. He said Renee was worried about me being alone. He said Lily missed her grandpa. He said their lease was up in March, and wouldn't it make sense, really just make sense, for them to come stay for a while? Help around the house, share expenses, give me some company. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I talked to my neighbor about it. He said he thought it sounded nice having family around. I called my brother in Arizona, and he said the same thing. Nobody told me to get anything in writing. They moved in on a Saturday in early March, a rental truck and 7 hours, and Lily running in and out of the house like she'd always lived there. I cooked dinner that first night, pot roast, Carol's recipe, and we sat around the table, and it felt, I'll admit it, it felt like something, like the house had a heartbeat again. The first few months were fine, more than fine. Renee cooked 2 or 3 nights a week. Marcus fixed the gutters, replaced a section of fence. Lily and I had a routine. After her school bus dropped her off, she'd come find me in the garage where I was usually puttering around, and I'd make us hot chocolate and we'd sit on the back steps until Renee got home from work. But things started to shift, the way things do, so gradually you don't notice each individual change. Marcus's business, I slowly understood, was not doing well. He was home more than he was working. He was on his phone constantly, talking in a low voice in the bedroom with the door closed. I started to notice he was tense at meals, distracted. When I asked how work was going, he'd say, "Picking up," or "slow season," and change the subject. Then one evening in August, about 5 months in, he asked if he could borrow money. Not a small amount. He needed $12,000, he said, to cover materials for a contract job that was supposed to pay out in 60 days. He had the contract right there. He showed it to me. He said he'd pay me back with interest. He said this was just a cash flow problem, completely normal in contracting. I gave it to him. Of course I did. He was my son-in-law. The 60 days passed, then 90. When I asked, he said the client had delayed. He showed me emails. He was very good at showing me things. That was the first loan. There was a second one 4 months later, $8,000 that time for equipment, and a third $5,000 for something I didn't fully understand involving a subcontractor. $25,000 over the course of about 8 months. My own daughter never once brought it up. Looking back, I believe she knew. The changes at home got harder to ignore. They'd taken over the main bedroom. That was Marcus's idea. He said my bedroom was at the back of the house, and it would be easier for them to hear Lily at night if they were at the front. I moved to the back bedroom, the smaller one that used to be Renee's when she was growing up. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a room. Then came the conversation about the garage. Marcus wanted to convert it into a workspace for his business. I said I used the garage. He said, for what exactly? I said, for my tools, my woodworking stuff, the things I'd had for 30 years. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was deciding not to argue. A week later, I went out there, and my workbench had been pushed against the wall, and there were wire shelving units where I used to keep my router and my table saw. I said something to Renee about it. She said, Dad, he needs a place to work. You're barely out there anymore. I wasn't barely out there anymore because there was no room to be out there anymore, but I didn't say that. I was trying to keep the peace. Then in the spring, this was about 11 months after they'd moved in, Renee sat me down and said she wanted to talk about the house. She said she'd been thinking. She said it didn't make sense for me to be rattling around in a 4-bedroom house by myself when I was gone. She said this gently, like it was a kindness, that as I got older, I might need care that they couldn't provide at home. She said there was a very nice assisted living facility about 12 miles away that had great reviews. She was talking about putting me in a home. I was 68 years old. I walked 2 miles every morning. I had no health conditions beyond a managed blood pressure. I was not confused. I was not declining. I was not rattling around anywhere. I was sitting in my own kitchen in the house I had owned since 1993, listening to my daughter suggest that I relocate so she and her husband could continue to live in it. I didn't say any of that. I said I'd think about it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in that back bedroom, Carol's sewing room originally, now with a bed and a small dresser and not much else. And I stared at the ceiling, and I started doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I started paying attention. Over the next 3 weeks, I paid attention to everything. Marcus had a second phone. I noticed it by accident. He'd left it on the counter and it buzzed while he was in the shower, and when I glanced at it, I didn't recognize the number or the name in the notification. I didn't pick it up. I just noted it. Mail had been redirected. I noticed because a financial statement I was expecting from my brokerage hadn't arrived, and when I called them, they confirmed my mailing address had been changed to a P.O. box I didn't recognize. A P.O. box I didn't recognize. I wrote down the box number. I didn't say anything to Renee or Marcus. I went to the post office the next morning and explained that I'd gotten a call about my account address. The woman behind the counter wasn't supposed to give me information about who had opened the box, but she looked at my ID and looked at the account number I showed her on my statement, and she said, "Whoever set this up used your name, sir." Whoever set this up used my name. I drove home, and I sat in the car in front of my own house for about 20 minutes. Then I called my insurance company, not to make a claim. I called a woman I'd worked with for 11 years, a compliance officer named Patricia, who had spent the better part of her career looking at the same kinds of things I'd spent mine looking at. I told her what I'd found. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Frank, you need to call someone else first, today." She gave me the number for the district office of the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Bureau of Consumer Protection. I called from my car, still parked outside the house. The investigator I spoke to was a young man, very professional. He asked me specific questions. He asked about financial accounts, about property records, about any documents I might have signed in the past year. When he asked about property records, something cold moved through me. I hadn't even thought to check the property records. I went to the county recorder's office the next morning. I told the clerk I wanted to pull the records on my address. She typed it in, and the screen showed me something that I had to read twice to understand. My house had been refinanced 6 weeks earlier. A home equity line of credit, $240,000, secured against my property. My signature was on the document. I had not signed that document. I sat down in the chair next to the clerk's desk, and I put my hands on my knees and I breathed. She asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. I was not fine. I called the investigator back from the parking lot. He told me to come in person and to bring everything I had. I asked him how serious this was. He said, "Sir, what you're describing is felony mortgage fraud and identity theft. So I'd say it's fairly serious." I didn't go home that night. I called my brother in Arizona and told him what was happening. I stayed at my neighbor Ted's house. Ted is 74, a retired electrician, and he sat across from me at his kitchen table while I laid out everything I'd found. And he just shook his head slowly and said, "Frank, I'm so sorry." That was all. It was the right thing to say. Over the next 10 days, things moved quickly in ways I could not have anticipated. The AG's office contacted the lender and put a hold on the HELOC. The funds had been accessed, about $60,000 drawn down, but the remaining funds were frozen. They opened a formal investigation. A detective from the County Financial Crimes Unit got involved. They pulled bank records, phone records, the documents from the P.O. box. I had to give a formal statement about the loans I'd made to Marcus. $25,000 in personal loans with no written agreement. That part wasn't criminal. It was just a loss I'd have to absorb. But it pointed to a pattern. Marcus's second phone, it turned out, had been used to communicate with the mortgage broker who had processed the HELOC. That broker lost his license. Marcus was arrested on a Thursday morning. The charge was felony mortgage fraud and forgery. Renee was not charged. Investigators concluded she hadn't been involved in the actual document forgery, but she had known about the P.O. box. She had known about the HELOC. She had said nothing to me. The day after Marcus was arrested, Renee called me. She was at a friend's house with Lily. She was crying. She said she hadn't known it would go this far. She said Marcus had told her it was just borrowing against the equity, that it was something people did, that they were going to fix it before I ever found out. I listened to all of it. I didn't say much. At one point she said, "Dad, I'm your daughter." And I said, "I know, sweetheart. I know you are." Then I said, "You need to get Lily's things out of the house by the end of the week." She started to say something, and I said quietly, "That's not a negotiation, Renee." She was gone in 3 days. She took what was hers and Lily's, left Marcus's things boxed up in the garage, and left. I watched them back out of the driveway from the front porch. Lily looked at me out the rear window of the car as they pulled away. She's 7 now. She didn't understand what had happened. She won't for a long time. That one was hard. The HELOC was contested and substantially unwound through the fraud proceedings. The lender, having dealt with the broker who lost his license, agreed to a settlement that limited my liability to a fraction of what had been drawn. My attorney, a woman I found through Pennsylvania legal aid, said I was fortunate the investigation moved as fast as it did. Marcus pled guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of identity theft. He was sentenced to 18 months probation, a substantial fine, and mandatory restitution. No prison time, which I'll admit disappointed me. But my attorney said it was a reasonable outcome given the circumstances and his lack of prior record. The civil matter is still ongoing. I'm told I'll recover something from the loans. Probably not everything. I changed my locks, all of them. Had a locksmith come and rekey every door, and this time I kept every copy myself. I also had a conversation with my brokerage and my bank, changed all the account passwords, updated the mailing addresses, added a verbal password to all accounts. It took about 3 hours, and I should have done all of it years ago. I won't pretend the house feels the same. It doesn't. I walk past the back bedroom sometimes. Renee's old room, the room I slept in for almost a year, and I feel something I don't quite have a word for. Not anger. Exactly. More like the particular tiredness that comes after you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time and you finally set it down. I talk to my brother more now. I had dinner with Ted last Friday. I'm back at the food bank on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Lily's birthday is in February. I sent her a card and a gift, a book she'd mentioned wanting, and a stuffed animal we'd looked at together at a store the summer before all of this. Renee texted me a photo of her opening it. She was grinning in that gap-toothed way, 7-year-old's grin. I'm still here, in my house with my maple tree in the front yard, 31 years of living inside these walls. Some things they couldn't take. The morning light through the kitchen window at 7 a.m., the sound the back steps make in November, the knowledge, which I had to find my way back to, that I am not as easy to get rid of as some people thought. I made 1 phone call to someone who had spent her career asking the same questions I had. I trusted my instincts, the ones I'd spent 32 years building, the ones I'd forgotten to use at home. That's the thing about expertise. You earn it for a reason, and sometimes the reason turns out to be yourself. I keep thinking about that maple tree. I planted it the spring Renee was born. 30-some years later, I was standing underneath it, holding my ribs, waiting for my son-in-law to bring me a key to my own front door, and I still didn't see it clearly. That's the part that stays with me, not the betrayal itself, but how long I looked right at it and called it something else. People ask me sometimes what I would have done differently, and I used to say I wouldn't have let them move in, but that's not really true. I would have let them move in. I would have helped them. That part of me isn't something I want to change. What I would have done differently is stay awake, stay myself. I spent 32 years in a job that required me to notice things, inconsistencies, gaps, the small details people leave behind when they're not telling the whole truth. And then I came home and turned all of that off because I thought love meant not looking too closely. That was my mistake, not trust. Trust isn't the problem. The problem is what happens when you stop thinking clearly about the people you trust. Marcus made his choices. I've turned that over many times, and I always come back to the same place. He wasn't a man who fell into a bad situation. He was a man who looked at my life, the house I built, the savings Carol and I were careful about for 40 years, and he decided it was easier to take it than to build his own. That's not a momentary lapse. That's a character. And Renee, my daughter, knew enough to stop it and didn't. The hardest thing I've had to make peace with isn't the fraud. It's understanding that the people who hurt you most are sometimes the ones who had every reason not to. But here's what I also know. When I finally did act, I acted clearly. I went to the county recorder's office. I sat in that parking lot and made the call. I followed it through, every step, even when it meant my daughter packed her car and drove away with my granddaughter in the back seat. Doing the right thing isn't always clean. Sometimes it costs you something real, and you do it anyway. That's not stubbornness. That's the only kind of self-respect that actually holds up over time. Patricia told me once, years ago at work, that the cases that go wrong are almost never the complicated ones. They're the ones where somebody already knew something was off and waited too long to say so. I thought about that a lot this past year. I thought about all the moments I noticed something. The second phone, the redirected mail, the way Marcus changed the subject and chose to wait. Patience is a virtue until it becomes a way of avoiding what you already know. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a while, but what I feel now is something closer to clarity. I know who I am. I know who I am. I know what I built. I know what I'm willing to do to protect it. And I know what I'm not willing to do to keep the peace. Those are things Marcus never understood about me and Renee forgot. Lily's birthday card is on my refrigerator. She drew a picture of the two of us on the back steps with hot chocolate, the maple trees in the background, small and a little crooked, the way she draws trees. I'm still here. So is the tree.